welcome to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti, and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews, we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and today I'm really looking forward to concluding our discussion about the New Orleans Mafia. We're going to be covering a lot of ground, from Prohibition to the Golden Era to present day, so hold on to your hats. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to become a Racket Reviews patron, please head on over to the Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, we have much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Let's briefly recap to get our bearings on the New Orleans Mafia. After defeating the Agnello brothers and their Palermitani crew, Matteo Manafu's short-lived secondary rebellion, the Sicilian murderer Giuseppe Esposito, and his uprising with wealthy fruit laborers union owner Joseph Provenzano, the coalition between Joseph Macheca, the influential dock owner, and Salvatore Matranga, the head of a violent criminal gang, had total control of the Crescent City. When Salvatore Matranga decided to retire, he passed control of the Stupaghieri crew onto his son Carlo or Charles Matranga. The Macheca-Matranga crew continued to have issues with Joseph Provenzano and his mafia crew, the Giardinieri. The Stupaghieri-Giardinieri conflict led to the brutal gang wars within the city. The New Orleans police chief, David Hennessy, who was nationally famous after his capture of the murderer Giuseppe Esposito, which led to the man's deportation, had previously brokered a weak peace deal between Matranga and Provenzano. With that peace deal being broken from the gang wars that plagued the city, Hennessy took matters into his own hands and led the charge to put the mobsters into custody and on trial. Hennessy's decision to get involved so deeply with this conflict would lead to his murder at the hands of the Macheca-Matranga crew, allegedly. After the death of the beloved police chief, 9 of the men involved were put on trial, resulting in a guilty verdict for none of them. The lack of conviction led to violent mobs fanned by local political leaders, resulting in the ambush on the Orleans Parish prison. This angry mob was in fact out for blood and murdered 11 Sicilian prisoners. 5 of the victims had nothing to do with the controversial case. 3 of the victims included the following: the man who had attempted to turn on the Stupaghieri, Manuel Polizzi, the man who was believed to have pulled the trigger on Hennessy, Rocco Geraci, and the Stupaghieri's longtime financier, Joseph Macheca. Charles Matranga would emerge from the tragedy unscathed and with more power over New Orleans than ever before. Alright, now you're all caught up. If those details are kind of fuzzy for you, please feel free to go back to the previous episodes to catch up, but right now let's move on to the next step. With Charles Matranga in control of New Orleans, he had 2 trusted men with whom he worked most closely: Corrado Giacona, who filled the role of a type of consigliere and business partner, and Sylvester Carolla, a young upstart toward the end of Matranga's career, who had risen through the ranks of Matranga's extortionist Black Hand group to a key lieutenant in the operation of the New Orleans French market. Matranga also had his brother Tony Matranga, who, as you may recall, lost his leg in our last episode, to run various businesses with him, specifically liquor and gambling. It is with Charles Matranga that we see the New Orleans organized crime move into the type of framework typically observed in New York and Chicago. By the way, both New York and Chicago would see New Orleans as an inner-city ally in the future, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Matranga would finally, after all of this back and forth with the Palermitani, the Fruit Laborers Union, the Giardinieri, be the unchallenged leader of New Orleans organized crime for nearly 2 decades. Nothing lasts forever, though, and challenges were certainly coming down the pike for the Matranga family. As it so often does with our organized crime stories, it all began with Prohibition. The Matranga family was already in the liquor business with Tony Matranga, but Tony and Charles were getting older. This wasn't the 19th century anymore, and they were in their 60s. Perhaps seeing that his day and time had come and gone, Charles Matranga made the decision to step down as boss in 1922, and there is debate within the organized crime communities about who really took over after that. The prevailing theory and official FBI narrative is that upon Matranga's retirement, he passed the torch onto Sylvester Carolla. On the other hand, the belief that Corrado Giacona took over as boss, while Carollo became the street boss, makes a lot of sense too. I think the reason it's assumed that Carollo took over after Matranga is because Carollo was the man who is rightly credited with shaping the New Orleans Mafia through bootlegging. We have covered Prohibition often on this channel, but it's always fun to see how it affected different people and places in the United States. Since Carollo was already heavily involved in the liquor business with Tony Matranga, being head of the family's expansion into bootlegging seemed like the next logical step, and it served him well. Carolla started as a rum runner in 1919. His front work was that of a restaurant owner, and he was involved with the fishing and dock rackets as well. But he made most of his money through gambling, prostitution, liquor, and narcotics. Because of Carolla's ultimate success, the position of boss for Giacona is often overlooked completely or seen as a type of placeholder position. As you'll see though, Carollo had a hard time staying out of the public eye and prison. He was charged with bootlegging and sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison in 1923, just 1 year after allegedly becoming boss. I'm not really sure what that 1 extra day after the year imprisonment was supposed to do, but that's how they sentenced him. He was sent to the Atlanta prison in Georgia, but would make it out on parole after 8 months, and he would return to New Orleans in 1925. This type of early release, especially for a first-time bootlegging charge, was not unusual. But don't worry, we're going to get into the unusual soon enough. An interesting rumor about Carollo is that he might have snubbed Al Capone in favor of Capone rival Joe Aiello. The story goes that Capone and his men had gone down to the Big Easy to strong-arm Carollo into no longer supplying Aiello, and they insisted that he supply to the Southside Chicago outfit instead. This is really more of a rumor than anything. Although there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Big Al was in the Big Easy at this time, that seems to be the reason for the rumor, not proof that the rumor is true. In February of 1930, Carollo would be arrested again, this time on a narcotics charge that involved not only the sale of illegal substances, but the shooting and wounding of undercover federal officer Cecil Moore in the ensuing gunfight. Needless to say that having Giacono while Carollo was causing the stir created a good balance for the New Orleans Mafia if Giacono was in fact the boss. Regarding bootlegging, Carollo was not the only one who realized the potential with illegal booze, and William Bailey was no slouch. In fact, at the time, if you were to ask who in New Orleans was the bootlegging kingpin, most would have responded with William Bailey. Bailey was always surrounded by a powerful group of bodyguards and had made a lot of money through bootlegging. Carollo knew that if he wanted to really be the boss of New Orleans bootlegging business, he needed to take Bailey out, and that's why he was the primary suspect in Bailey's Christmas-time murder. Carollo started by picking off Bailey's bodyguards. With machine gun fire and a dedicated group of men, Carollo was able to whittle Bailey's men down to a reasonable amount within a year. By just after Christmas of 1930, Carollo was able to wipe out his target, and fortunately for him, this left only 3 more years of Prohibition, but he made the best of it. William Bailey was exiting his home on December 28, 1930, when 2 mysterious cars pulled up. Bailey wasted no time in rushing back to his house and desperately flipping through his keys to get back inside. Sadly for Bailey, he was not able to find the house key in time to unlock the door, and Carollo himself, the story goes, walked up and blasted his rival with a sawed-off shotgun, killing him before he hit the ground. By this point, it's very important to note that the New Orleans authorities were saturated with corruption, especially when it came to Carollo and Giacono. The law would catch up with Carollo again in 1931, however, but it wasn't due to a lack of trying on the part of the New Orleans police. Carollo and his caporegime Trentoraro were handed a narcotics charge. The New Orleans police had even produced false witnesses to try to make a case that Carollo wasn't even in New Orleans at the time, but this did not hold any water. Both Carollo and Toraro were given 1.5 year sentences in January of 1931, once again sent to the Atlanta Federal Prison, but they were released in the spring of 1932 and returned to New Orleans. Then Carollo was sentenced to 8 to 15 years behind bars for the attempted murder of Agent Cecil Moore. However, Carollo was fully pardoned by Louisiana Governor Oscar Kelly Allen and would once again return to his criminal enterprises in 1934. By this time, Frank Costello was facing challenges in keeping his slot machines open in New York City and had been corresponding with the senator and former Louisiana Governor Huey Long to get his operations moved down south. Long obliged and helped Costello get in touch with Carollo, who was happy to get involved. This was Carollo's in with Costello and Meyer Lansky. Together, the 3 of them established gambling operations, casinos, and expanded into racing wires, which served them extremely well. Soon, the New Orleans Mafia was part of Lucky Luciano's commission and were represented by the Genovese family through Costello. What sweetened the deal even more for the New Orleans corruption, although the city didn't quite know his name yet, was that Carlos Marcello, or Marcello with the Italian pronunciation, a soldier under Carollo, had just been released from Angola State Prison. With the slot machines that had been moved out of New York, Carollo gave the green light for the 22-year-old Marcello to use these in his own gambling operations under the Carollo umbrella. Also, the 2 men would become relatives by marriage after the matrimony of Marcello's niece Maria Zaniata and Carollo's son Anthony Carollo. By 1947, Lansky, Costello, Carollo, and Marcello were running an enormous interstate gambling racket, and Marcello was the official New Orleans representative for this operation. The late 1940s were a challenging time for organized crime as a whole in the United States. Lucky Luciano was deported in 1946, and Silvestro Carollo would join Luciano in his deportation the next year in 1947, the same year that Al Capone died, even though he had been out of the game for several years at that point. I want to make sure that I give this proper timing, so I want you to just pause and think about all of the changes that were happening in the late 1940s in the United States generally in the world, and then how that affected organized crime specifically. Americans had been pulled out of the frying pan and thrown into the fire from the Great Depression to the Second Great War. World War II ends in 1945. The Cold War begins in 1947. The Prohibition era is a thing of the past, and the big bosses of that time were dying off, forgotten, or deported. Technology was advancing at an exponential rate. The population was beginning to boom. The unemployment rate is low. The people have money to burn, and gambling is how they want to do it. Las Vegas is receiving a huge influx of money from mobsters, and Marcello now has a hand in one of the largest gambling rackets of the 20th century with the commission. What a time to be alive, and what a time to be in the Mafia. Most sources, including the FBI, will list Carlos Marcello as Carollo's successor. There does seem to be a bit of a historic gap from 1947 to 1951, where there is debate about whether or not Carollo was still in control despite his deportation. Carollo did not stay in Italy and would be back in America within a few years. Marcello was certainly acting boss, if not fully boss, during this time. I honestly believe that the 37-year-old Marcello was the true blue boss of the Big Easy after Carollo's first deportation, and not after his second deportation in 1951, although I can understand both sides. Give or take a few years, Marcello was the boss of New Orleans for almost 4 decades. Marcello was the Don to expand the New Orleans Mafia outside of New Orleans. The Chicago outfit and the New York families were already well ahead of New Orleans in terms of expansion, but Carlos Marcello would sprint to make up that difference for the Big Easy. He expanded the family's operations out to Dallas, Texas, where the family had merely dipped their toes decades ago. Under Marcello's control, Dallas was essentially a branch of New Orleans. Of course, he worked with New York, specifically the Genovese family, in the field of gambling. This would give him a foothold in Las Vegas, which he was able to cling to, even though the New York families would eventually throw in the towel on that whole endeavor. Through his work with the Chicago outfit, specifically Sam Giancana, he managed to not only keep his arms around Las Vegas, but he also expanded his influence into Florida, specifically Tampa, where he would work closely with Tampa boss Santos Traficante Jr. These two mob bosses were more than just business partners. They were personal friends. And as I'm sure you can imagine or already know, the New Orleans Mafia would experience their golden era under Marcello. Because of Marcello's long reach and accommodating behavior with outside families, the New Orleans Mafia had expanded to 3,000 associates and 300 made members during the height of its power. Trouble began brewing for Marcello in 1951 during the Kefauver hearings, the Special Senate Committee specifically created to investigate organized crime. These hearings stretched across 14 cities and countless Marcello associates. When Marcello himself was made to appear, he would plead the Fifth Amendment 152 times. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that makes him the winner of the mobster to plead the Fifth the most times in one hearing. Maybe Vito Genovese had him beat, but if he did, it was not by much. One thing that Marcello did win, if you want to call it winning, is that the Kefauver Committee named him one of the worst criminals in the country. Skip forward about 10 years, and that classification did not go beyond Robert Kennedy's notice. When John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States in 1960, it was suspected by those keeping a close eye on the Mafia that it was due in no small part to the political corruption in Chicago, which won him Illinois, tipping the scale to his favor. I don't think that the same can be said about New Orleans and Louisiana. Kennedy had Louisiana locked down. What we do know is that the Chicago outfit, Sam Giancana in particular, and their associates such as Marcello, had expected the Kennedy administration to treat organized crime with kid gloves. However, JFK did no such thing when he placed his brother Robert Kennedy into the position of Attorney General, and Bobby Kennedy immediately started cracking down on mafiosi. Marcello was arrested by U.S. immigration officials and deported to Guatemala on April 4, 1961. He was known to have been born in Italy, but had a fake birth certificate from Guatemala. When the Guatemalan authorities realized that this was a fake birth certificate, they began a process of their own to deport Marcello. Before that case could begin, Marcello had disappeared and would be back in New Orleans by June. Despite numerous attempts, he was never deported from the United States again. Marcello was tried twice for conspiracy regarding his fake birth certificate, but was acquitted both times. Bribery was suspected, but never proven. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The official story is that he was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was then killed by Jack Ruby before he got a chance to say anything on November 24, 1963. Both Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald had associations with not only Carlos Marcello, but also Sam Giancana, two men who, according to many mafia theorists, are among the most likely to have been involved with or coordinated the Kennedy assassination. This suspicion of organized crime connection also holds with the assassination of Robert Kennedy on June 6, 1968. The motive was there without question, as were the means. Marcello would avoid a consorting with criminals charge in September of 1966, but then would be arrested for assaulting a federal agent within days. He was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years behind bars, but would be released after about 6 months. In 1978, Marcello was investigated by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and while they also maintained that the means, motives, and associations were there, they could not provide a direct link to Marcello. Marcello would finally be put away, and his criminal career would come to an end in 1981, when he was convicted of conspiracy, racketeering, and fraud. Marcello would remain behind bars until 1989. In 1989, after suffering multiple strokes, he would be sent home and would die on March 2, 1993. After Marcello was put away in 1981, the waters became very muddy, or maybe I should say swampy, for the New Orleans Mafia. It is the general consensus that Marcelo's little brother, Joseph Marcello Jr., briefly took over before Marcelo's nephew-in-law, Anthony Carollo, son of Silvestro Carollo, took over the rapidly shrinking family until his death on February 1st, 2007. The last breath of evidence about the existence of a functioning New Orleans Mafia as it came to be understood under Marcello was in 2014 when Joseph Gagliano, one of the very last remaining known mobsters and former Marcello underboss, was arrested and sentenced to 28 months in 2015 for a gun possession charge, which was coupled with the previous felony convictions. Gagliano was released in 2017 with, according to his lawyers, only an interest in selling snowballs or an Italian ice type of treat. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews, wrapping up our conversation about the New Orleans Mafia. I so appreciate all of you who recommended this to me. It's been an amazing study. While there is no evidence to suggest that there's still a functioning New Orleans Mafia, it is never wise to underestimate the power of organized crime in general. Mafia or no, there's no place on earth that is without corruption. Make sure to let me know in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter what you think about the New Orleans Mafia. Also, don't forget to utilize the comment section and social media to let me know who or what topic you would like to see covered next. I am planning on doing a Carlos Marcello spotlight, but if you have another mobster that you'd like to know more about, make sure to let me know. I always love hearing from you, and I'm always happy to investigate. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your sub box. Ciao!